My name is Jamie Lenhart, and welcome back to A Table for One. I'm still here in my office at home as I am getting the whole filming location set up at the church. Studio would probably not be the right word for it, but it's a place where we can film. And kind of the first rendition is up and running right now. And in that space, I was able to chat with Dan Lanning today and film a conversation between him and I that we're going to get to in just a few moments. But this week, I wanted to do something a little bit altered from our normal time together, and I'm cutting out some of the sections that we normally do and just kind of getting right to the conversation portion. So this week we're going to chat about kind of what we're doing right now and what our focus has been with home groups. And I want to just give room for that without all the other elements, and hopefully allow you to hear from Dan in a little bit different way. So let's go ahead and jump right into our table talk with Dan Lanning this week. Okay, thank you, Dan, for sitting down with me for our chat this week. So, you know, it's always that funny thing because we've done stuff so many times together for so long.
It's been a long time, yeah.
You know, it was funny when we started up the table. What was that, 3 years ago now?
It feels like that's about right.
Yeah. That it was funny because I remember doing it. There was a spot in there where you and I were both kind of talking and like giving some announcements and some direction. And it was like we just fell into the rhythm of so many years ago. It was like you'd say something, I'd say something. It just went.
And the banter flowed. And there was humor. Yeah.
Yeah. No. I love that. I love that we were able to fall back into that and do stuff together. But this week I wanted to talk to you about something very specific. Where often we're talking about what God's doing in people's lives, but right now we're really giving a focus in the church to something not really new, but just an adjustment to focus. And I wanted to then spend time with this to kind of lend weight, but also allow people to hear from your heart. Because, you know, sometimes when it's an announcement or something like that, it's more about getting the information out rather than hearing you. And so I want them to hear you in this as we talk about home groups and that personal connection. So what, I mean, briefly, what's kind of the focus of what we're doing right now?
So the focus for home groups, like you said, it's not, home groups themselves are not new. It's something that's been a part of Western church life for ages, something that's been a part of the life of our church for a long time. Our church has a history. Steve and I were just talking yesterday about how we used to have a whole wall in the entry hallway covered with the pictures of all of the small group leaders.
I remember that.
Yeah. And there were a fair few of them. So it's been something that for a long time has been part of the life of our church. But the focus on it right now is a bit of a new focus. And obviously, one of the reasons that it has become such a focus is because of the changes in how we're allowed to meet as a church and how we're allowed to share physical space with each other, in trying to understand the state regulations regarding COVID and what constitutes healthy and unhealthy behavior. The response of really focusing our efforts and our energy on home groups made a lot of sense because smaller groups are one of the safest ways of interacting relationally with each other. But it was also a good time to recover that focus on home groups because historically speaking, smaller get-togethers, home groups and things like them have been one of the most historically available and effective forms of experiencing the life of the Lord together. We see it in the early church, obviously in the book of Acts and what happens there. There were no buildings outside of the synagogues. People got together and shared in homes. And in a lot of nations throughout the course of the world, when gathering together in public has not been an option for any of a variety of reasons, home churches have been the go-to response, and they've been an incredibly effective way to keep people engaged in the process of spiritual life and transformation that God offers to us in relationally connecting to each other. So during this season, it seemed like a really good opportunity to start reclaiming that and moving toward it as a way of helping to maintain the life of the church, but also a way of recovering some of the elements that have been lost by not being able to get together for weekend services.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. So I'd love people to hear it. So what's your experience like with home groups? Like what, or maybe I should go more specific. What is, maybe what is an experience you had that maybe didn't go the best with a small group? Maybe an awkward moment.
Let's see. By and large, most of my experiences with home groups have been positive, although, I mean, I suppose to be fair, so by their nature, gatherings of that size, smaller gatherings, are going to come with a greater degree of intimacy, a greater degree of closeness and vulnerability. And there are moments where that can come with certain complications. I have been part of home groups before where people in the group started experiencing certain relational strains from outside the context of the group. And then when we came to the group and were trying to safely interact with each other, there was sort of that underlying, well,
Just tension.
right, we have to try and be close and open and vulnerable here, but I don't really trust that person because of X, Y, and Z that happened outside in the context of my normal life. That I've seen happen before, and navigating that can be difficult. It can introduce strains and difficulties, and a lot of times that tension is noticeable and it can stop other people from engaging and being intimate and open in those times. But yeah.
So I mean, it's life together.
Exactly.
It's
Yes.
yeah. No, I mean, I've been in the same type of situations where it's like, oh, I know that happened. This is going to get a little weird.
Do we pretend like it didn't happen? Do we try to do things like normal? Or do we take a minute and talk about the elephant in the room and really ask everybody to get vulnerable for a couple of minutes? How do we handle this?
Yeah. And there's no right answer.
No, there isn't.
It's like, I've been in ones where it's like, you address it. I've been in ones that maybe I sat down and addressed it with someone.
Right.
It's like, you know,
Yeah.
you might need to get, but other times it's just like, let's just give it some time.
Yeah.
Like, so yeah, I mean, and that's, you know, that's sometimes I think a lesson overall with church of it's like, it's the same thing. It's just in a smaller setting.
Yeah.
Where, yeah, there's somebody maybe you didn't have a great interaction with. Well, I'll just sit on the other side of the sanctuary. Well, when you're only 10 feet away.
Yep. When there's only 8 people in the room.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
But I think, you know, in many ways, that's such a good thing. Because it teaches us to work through it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, I mean, in general, that's something that we struggle with, I think. And I don't know if this is a human nature thing or an American culture thing, but there is a tendency when we are confronted with certain relational strains, there is a tendency to, I don't want to call it taking the easy way out because that's oversimplifying things. That's not fair to the experiences and the emotional turmoil that people deal with in those things. But we do have a tendency to deal with things by distancing ourselves and removing ourselves rather than finding ways to deal with it. And in the context, like you said, in a larger congregation, when I can just sit on the other side, or I can come to the 9 o'clock service when that person goes to the 11, it's easier to allow that distance. But if I'm getting together with a smaller group of 8 to 10 people on a regular basis, and me and somebody else have tension in our relationship, it's not as easy to let that distance happen without it being very dramatically obvious to people.
Yeah.
And we don't like the obvious. In those moments, if we can deal with the tension by kind of letting things go quietly, I've seen people opt for that option. I've opted for that option any number of times in my life. But especially as I get older, I become more and more convinced of the value. Yes. Yes.
Should I buy you a cane after this?
Just about. Hey, you're not far behind me, my friend. So
well, technically, I did buy you a cane at one point.
That's true.
That's a different story.
Yes, it is. Yeah. And your 40th is coming up, isn't it? So. Yeah. Where were we? Distance in relationships. The older I get, the more convinced I become of the value of working to make some recovery in those areas. And even as I say that, I have to admit to some hypocrisy for myself in that regard, because there are certainly relationships that I have had historically where that distance has taken place, and I still have work to do in apologizing and in recovering in some of those places. But I'm becoming more and more convinced of the value of it. And how worth it is to lean into those difficulties, I think is what I'm trying to say. So.
Well, I think there's also a flip side to it a little bit, that there's also the element, when you're in a large church, large service, you find people that you interact with and things like that, and sometimes in a smaller group, there's, I hate using the term, but there's a chemistry thing that sometimes you just don't connect.
Oh yeah.
And that's okay.
Yes, it is okay.
And I sometimes I would say it's not a huge thing, but it is a negative. Sometimes we'll treat in the church, we're like, well, you should get along with everybody.
Yes.
We're all believers. We're all a family. It's like, well, we're also come from totally different contexts and experience, and sometimes we just don't mesh.
Right.
And that's okay.
It is.
Not that there's antagonism. It's just,
Right.
I just don't connect with this person for some reason.
Right. And like you said earlier, when in the process of dealing with strains and tensions, there's no right answer to that. In the process of navigating the interpersonal dynamics and the chemistry of home groups, there's no right answer there either.
No.
Because I've seen circumstances and situations where those sort of disparate personalities ended up working really well, and then other times where forcing it created problems and difficulties. And so there is a degree to which, most home groups are going to be the result of, I get on well with these people. These are folks that I enjoy spending time with. These are folks that I am comfortable being open with and talking about life and what God is doing in my story and in my journey. But I've seen other times where when you try to force the chemistry, or when you try to put people in the same room and then require that degree of vulnerability when they're not comfortable with it, it doesn't necessarily go that well.
Yeah.
And so there has to be space for that dialogue and to say, these are people that I could go there with. And and I've seen it go both ways, and I've experienced both. So.
Same here. And so with what we're doing right now, we have some groups that have been going on for years and years and years. My mom's part of one of those.
Yep.
We talk about that often. But there's other ones that have started or are thinking of starting and in this season. So maybe the challenge maybe for people is, how do they get into a group?
Right.
I mean, is it that there's ones already started for them to join? Is if somebody's interested, like, oh, I can get together with a couple people in my house.
Right.
Like, how does somebody go about doing that in this season?
There are any number of ways. And one of the issues that we've experienced over the last few years is the issue of lack of visibility to some of the groups. Like we said, that used to be that the groups were very visible. It was easy to see. It was easy to understand who they were, a really recognizable part of the life of the church. And that hasn't necessarily been true for a while now. And they've been happening, like you said, your mom's group and several others are very long-term groups, but they happen behind the scenes. And you only hear about it because you talk to people who are in those groups. And that's kind of that still exists. That's still there. Those groups are still being encouraged. And so now we're in a season where we're trying to say, all right, how do we start some new ones? How do we get people connected to new ones? So I would say there are a couple of ways to accomplish that. The biggest way that we're encouraging is for people who already have relationships and connections in the church, people that you're comfortable with, familiar with, especially during this season right now, people that you feel medically safe and responsible with.
Yeah.
Call it a quarantine circle, call it whatever you want.
Quarantine circle.
People that you don't mind sharing space with. Just spontaneously reaching out to them and saying, hey, let's get together this week and dialogue about what God is doing in our lives, whatever that looks like. And so we're encouraging kind of the spontaneous growth that way. But I recognize that that's not comfortable for everybody. Not everyone feels comfortable physically hosting or really reaching out and starting something like that. Or there are lots of people who are in situations of compromised health and they don't feel comfortable having anybody in their space, and I get that, and I want to leave room for people to make wise decisions for themselves and for their health. So in that regard, one of the things that we're trying to do is leverage technology and utilize Zoom. We're encouraging, or any of the other dozens of video softwares. We're encouraging people to get together. I realize it's not as personal, it's not as much fun, but there is an element there where that can be recovered. And so one of the things we've started to do here at the church is on Wednesday nights at 7, we're having the home groups online where people can log in via Zoom. There's a button on the church's Facebook page, or not Facebook, I apologize, the church's website where you can click and it'll open up the Zoom room, and we're welcoming people to come to that. And what we're trying to do is engage in some of those life level conversations about what God is doing and what's happening personally.
Which obviously also with that, it may not be to the same level of vulnerability and intimacy as a group that's in a home.
Right.
But it sounds like it's a good starting place because you can kind of get to know some people in this
and that was
avenue.
One of the goals with that, because as we were talking about that, we knew by the nature of how that was designed, different people were going to be joining us each week. There wasn't going to be a lot of consistency in who was there. And that meant that each week we were going to end up having conversations with different groups of people. And there wouldn't necessarily be that opportunity to develop the automatic chemistry.
Yeah.
Or we would just randomly end up getting paired with people where that chemistry just didn't feel like it was there. And we would be running into some of those dynamics that were talked about earlier. And we knew that would be an element, and that could present limitations to how open we were willing to be with each other. And somebody mentioned, well, what do we do if people start developing chemistry with a group and they start requesting, well, when I log in on Wednesday night, can I be with so-and-so and so-and-so? And the immediate response at that point was to say, no, but why don't you talk to them about starting an in-person group and getting together on your own? If you are developing chemistry, that seems like a fantastic segue to getting people together in a more intentional space.
Or I could even see that if they're saying, I want to connect with this group, it's, well, if you can't do it in person still, say still you're compromised, start your own digital group.
Exactly. Yes.
That would make total sense. I suddenly in my head I'm like, oh, so it's a feeder program. So that's the minor league to the home group, that major league. Is that what we're
not deliberately? I suppose it could function that way for people.
I'm just trying to hit some of the guys here. Like we're going to use some sports metaphors because I use those so much.
Yep. Exactly. Exactly.
But no, that makes a lot of sense to use it in that.
And so those end up becoming kind of the two primary answers to the questions. How do you get involved? If you have a network of people, invite them, start, have some conversations. If you don't feel like you're there or you need some space for health and safety reasons, then getting connected online. Those are kind of the two primary things that we've been looking at as ways to get people involved. And kind of the biggest need in that regard is finding a person or a couple who are willing to step forward enough to say, I will take the initiative and invite and involve people, and I will take the initiative to start some of these conversations. That's really the big thing that we're finding there's a lack of right now. And there are, I'm sure, 1,000 reasons why that's the case, but really what would be great to see is just people who are willing to say, yeah, I know some people in the church that I would love to be getting together with. And seeing, I don't want to make it an issue only and purely about bravery and faith, because I realize it's more complex than that. People don't feel equipped, they don't feel capable. I get all that. That makes sense. But it would be fantastic to see some people who are willing to step forward and say, yeah, that's something I value, I would like to. And then let us know so that we can come alongside and say, let's help. How can we help facilitate this and give you some pointers and give you some direction and give you some resources. And that's one of the things that in this upcoming season, especially as the weather turns bad, because a lot of groups have been meeting outdoors, which has been advisable, and now that's no longer going to be possible because Oregon rains. That's just what happens here. We want to start opening up rooms at the church for people to be able to sign up for and meet in rooms that are a little bit bigger and they can appropriately social distance from each other. That's one of the ways that we want to resource people, is in making those spaces available.
Okay.
So.
I thought of two more questions I really want to make sure I hit before we end our time. One of them is, so another thing, I know you and I have talked about it, and I brought it up on the videos and Table for One too, is like another way for people to kind of start this process is, and especially even if they're like, I work nights and I don't have a lot of time during the week to get together with people, or it could just be because of my kids, I cannot do this, which
that's a big one for people.
We all run into that, of the idea of well, what about inviting somebody over and watching the service together on Sunday?
Uh-huh.
Like that's also an opportunity to do the same thing we're talking about.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's one of the things we've put a lot of effort into, the quality of the live streams and in the accessibility of that. And we're going to continue. We've had a lot of conversations with our district supervisor, Gabe, and he encouraged us from the beginning. He said, you guys that's a great response to the moment. But he said, even after the current season is over and in-person services can start regularly again, maintain that, keep that, because of the availability for connection that it creates. And so, yes, getting people together, find some of those people that you are comfortable sharing the same space with, get into the same place, watch the service together. Feel free to recover some of those elements of relational connectedness as you engage with the weekend services. Yes.
So then the last one I have is, because, I mean, if I'm sure people are watching the news, reading the paper, seeing that, numbers are climbing in Lane County, and, the reality is whether you worry about it or not isn't the issue in this. It's that, we're trying to also be responsible how we do things, that, if tighter restrictions happen, the good thing with this is, for the most part, you can still do some small group interactions. But are we looking at this saying, okay, what happens if they start tightening things down? So it sounds like one of the things is providing some space here that's big enough for people to use. And probably being intentional on the size of their groups that they're getting together with.
Very much so, yes.
So we're just trying to be really intentional with that.
Yeah, and it's a tough balance, because we want to do our due diligence as an organ business to follow the rules that have been given to us. And just for the sake of clarity, right now, churches are not following any different set of rules than any other business is. We have the same opportunities and the same restrictions that anyone else does. The complication arises from, especially regarding our weekend services, just the number of people that we pack in and the closeness, and that is very difficult to reproduce in the current circumstances. It's difficult to reproduce anywhere, like music concerts and venues and orchestra, chamber music and things like that are having all of the same difficulties.
And the reality is even just the design of our church facility has always had a challenge with that.
Exactly.
I mean, I remember back in the day when 2 packed out Sunday morning services, you could barely get one service out and another service in, because we don't have large area to move through. So that one more layer.
The phrase that I heard used was sociological strangulation. That given the geography of the space and having people that close, nobody enjoys, feeling like it's their middle school hallways or whatever. And exactly.
Don't bring that up.
Exactly. So, but yeah. So we're trying to walk that balance between how do we interact well with the regulations and how do we give people freedom to make decisions for themselves at the same time, because I don't want to dictate to anyone, this is what you have to do in responding to this moment. I want to obviously give people the freedom to make their own choices and do what they're comfortable with, while maintaining the church's response to the regulations placed upon us. So the goal is to try and provide the resources we can and let everybody make their decisions. And so in that regard, as we move into the future, if the phase that we're in does change for Lane County, it will change the resources we're able to offer here at the church, depending on the number of people in the group and space and things like that. But other than that, it's up to people to really make good decisions and to interact well. And I'm not going to step into the middle of that and try to tell you what you can and can't do. I think that would be unhelpful.
And allowing people to, I mean, the role that we're in serving people, pastoring people, whatever we want to call it, helping them in their spiritual formation. It's not telling them what to do. It's facilitating God in their life.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
You get to make the decision.
My job is to help get you to a place where you can hear from Jesus and he can give wisdom and guidance for your life. And then I am willing to stand alongside and say, yes, that sounds like the voice of God. Let's figure this out together as you move forward. So,
well, Dan, thank you for coming and sitting down with me and getting to share this. It's, it's a little different conversation than what we normally do, but I think it's an important one. And also to hear just what we just had to hear at the end of what we're trying to do for the church at large. So thank you, and I think this will be a good little bit of clarification and hopefully encouragement.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation together. And you know, as Dan was saying, this idea of home groups or small groups where we get together and share life, that's nothing new. It's nothing new in the life of the church in general. It's nothing new to Springfield Faith Center. And really, we're kind of adjusting back and focusing in on a foundational element that we really should always have as a really major part of our walk. And this is giving us a wonderful opportunity to say, well, since we can't do this other thing that we are used to, let's go back to this foundational element and really invest in that time. And something kind of came up in me as I was prepping and editing and everything for this, and it was out of Ecclesiastes. It was Ecclesiastes 1:9, and it said, what has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. And you know, again, small groups or home groups are not new. It's revisiting a practice and investing in a practice that's really important. So, you know, I hope that in that conversation you heard some of Dan's heart and the direction that he's feeling really strongly about going, and got to hear why it's important to him and why we think it's important to the life of the church. So, you know, also within all that, we understand that not everybody feels free to get together in each other's homes or even necessarily has the connections for that. That's again why we're offering the midweek Zoom meeting Wednesdays at 7 o'clock. But also, you know, it's something it's not rocket science. Maybe it's just inviting somebody over to watch the service, like I've said over and over, because I say it over and over because it's something so easy that we can do. And maybe it's just getting together for dinner with somebody and sharing what God's doing in your life. And maybe it's using those questions to introduce those things that we have after the service. It's again, this is something that it's approachable. It's actually very easy to do. But if you don't have the connections, we want to encourage you to check out those midweek Zoom times. So I again, I hope this was encouraging and was clarifying. And otherwise, I hope everybody has a wonderful week and that we will see you again next week with a Table for One. God bless.